right, everyone. Welcome to the show. Thanks for being here. We've got an amazing lineup here for you tonight. It is the evolution of medicine. We are talking about the reinvention of mental health. We're going to super excited to welcome here my guests for this evening. I have two incredible guests who are on the front edge of this reinvention in very different ways. So my first guest is Dr. Erin Amato. She's a psychiatrist practicing in Montana, and we're going to be chatting with her about her own reinvention of mental health around depression. And we also have Ben Rolnick, who is heading up the Stanford Center for Healthcare Innovation. So super excited to welcome them both here this evening. And let's start with you, Dr. Amato. So what I found over time in functional medicine is that sometimes the reinvention can be encapsulated in one doctor's story. And I have a nagging feeling that that's you. So tell us your journey to psychiatry and then to this reinvention.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me on, James. And my journey into psychiatry really started very early on in medical school. I loved the study of the brain. I loved the relationships that I was able to build with my patients. And I think part of it too was I've always kind of rooted for the underdog, and psychiatry at that time was not a very popular, or it didn't seem like it was always a very well-respected specialty in medicine. And the messages I got from some of my attendings were, oh, psych, I would never want to do that. No one ever gets better. And I just felt like I wanted to fight for my patients and fight the stigma that was out there with mental health. So my residency training was really quite traditional in terms of a lot of emphasis on psychopharmacology and psychotherapy. And I also did a fellowship in child and adolescent psychiatry. So my first several years of practice were very traditionally based. And the change in my practice really happened in 2014 when I lost my first patient to suicide. And even though we know that that's a possibility within the field of psychiatry, that hit me very hard. And the timing of that was right around the same time that the world lost Robin Williams as a brilliant actor and comedian. And that just really set me on the path of reevaluating where I was at with my practice and with the specialty, and wanting something more, looking at the other patients I was treating and realizing we had tried so many medications and other therapies and they weren't getting better. So that's when I really started looking at TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, as a treatment for depression. That's really where I was starting to hear the first murmurings about ketamine as a treatment for depression. And so that year I embarked on bringing TMS into my practice. I started doing my first couple of cases with ketamine, really kind of kept it quiet because as I started to talk about other psychiatrists, I got a lot of pushback where they thought it was too dangerous. They just weren't comfortable with it. So I was doing these treatments kind of quietly, but starting to see some really good outcomes. And so that's a direction that I've really grown my practice over the last several years. And it was around that same time too that I started to hear about functional medicine, even though I had never heard that term before. But I found A4M as an organization. I attended a conference and it was just blown away at the knowledge that I was being exposed to, and also the other doctors and healthcare practitioners that seemed just passionate and motivated and interested in the field of medicine, whereas a lot of medicine, there's so much hand-wringing and unhappy doctors. So it just really reinvigorated my practice. And so the next few years, I was attending lots of conferences and doing every bit of continuing education that I could, with trying to narrow it down somehow to figure out how is this applicable to psychiatry and to my practice, and figuring out what is the model to bring this information to my patients. So a few years ago, I founded a separate practice called the Center for Ideal Health, where we were doing comprehensive personalized medicine programs, not necessarily specific to mental health, but really working with people on lifestyle changes and interventions that would help with things like gut function. And what we saw was a lot of people from my psychiatric practice followed us over to the personalized medicine practice because they already knew us, they trusted us. And we just saw such incredible outcomes where not only were they seeing some improvements in their depression and anxiety and sleep and energy levels, but we were also seeing benefits in terms of their lipids being better and their hypertension being better. And so we ran into some stumbling blocks with that practice with COVID. And so we're going through a bit of a reinvention now with the Center for Ideal Health now evolving into the Mood Restoration Institute, which we're really starting to launch over the next few months. And I'm just excited with where it's going. And again, just always questioning what is the best model to try to bring this care to patients, because I work with a lot of very, very ill patients when we're doing things like ketamine or TMS. And sometimes they're too debilitated with their depression to really easily make tons of lifestyle changes all at once. So trying to figure out how to deliver those changes in a way that's going to make meaningful progress is always something that's on the forefront of my mind.
We'll definitely come back to that conversation a little bit later, but I really appreciate that journey. And maybe, Ben, I could just start by having you comment on that journey, because I just feel like a lot of the stuff that you're involved with was mentioned there, and probably that reinvention of Dr. Amato's practice doesn't surprise you given what you know. You're on mute.
Yeah, I was going to say absolutely. I think what Dr. Amato is working on is truly profound and absolutely important. There's an interesting book by Antonio Damasio called Descartes' Error, and he's a USC. I think he's a neurologist or a psychologist, one or the other. But essentially, the whole premise of the book is that Descartes made a big error separating the mind and the body. And I think that error persists in all of academic and clinical medicine. And I think that, the time has sort of come that we need to recollapse the mind and the body to understand that we're one whole organism. So the whole concept of functional medicine and, people healing their minds through their bodies, I think is really an essential aspect of this reinvention of mental health care. And, speaking about some of the new types of modalities and interventions like ketamine therapy, is assisted psychotherapy. I mean, it's sort of like whatever works. Right now, 1 in 5 people, in the US are depressed. It costs the US, over $210 billion a year. And a lot of that cost is relating to kind of absenteeism and presenteeism and, kind of lost productivity in industry. And, people are suffering, and that was bad before COVID. I think I read some statistics that, just from the beginning of COVID through like a little bit later, April, June, July, the mental health statistics doubled, and they got twice as worse. So this is really, I mean, speaking about depression, mental health, et cetera, is really an important aspect for us. And just to kind of say one aspect on my background and our place approaching this at Stanford. So traditionally, the lab and the group that I work with is a very hardcore biology lab. So, Mike Snyder, who's our faculty director, has invented a lot of the precision medicine techniques and tools that have been popularized today, including RNA-seq, so essentially transcriptomics. So not just looking at your DNA, but looking at how your DNA is being expressed. And, when we start to think about some of these downstream omics technologies, a lot of them have not been applied to mental health at all. So, mental health is oftentimes diagnosed in these blurry categories, right? And when we start to think, what does it look like to add more robust physical, biological biomarkers, it starts to broaden our perspective of what does it actually mean to be depressed. We know that for diseases like diabetes, there are a lot of different mechanisms of action behind the disease. You could be diabetic because your pancreas doesn't release enough insulin, or you could be diabetic because your cells are insulin resistant. There are any number of factors. There's more than that. And the treatment that you use depends on what that endophenotype is, what that direct underlying mechanism is. And I think that we've just scratched the surface right now in, kind of understanding the biology and the mechanisms of depression and how to treat it. So, I really applaud you, Dr. Amato, and, everyone who's listening to this, who's on the cutting edge trying to figure this stuff out, because it really matters. If your quality of life and your mind, it makes everything under the haze of a bad mood and you can't enjoy your life, then, kind of what does health really mean at that point?
Yeah. Well, at a recent conference, Dr. Leo Galland, who's one of the founders of functional medicine, said, the more complex your case and the more specialists can't figure out what's going on, the more you're in need of what he calls this, like the missing curriculum. And really the missing curriculum, you had to go to A4M4. Some people go to other organizations for, but in my mind, that missing curriculum is salutogenesis. And I'd love to just ask you, yes, Ben, because I'd never met anyone apart from who was in our little weird world of functional medicine or naturopathic doctors who has that on your LinkedIn profile. And now someone in your role talking about scaling salutogenesis, I was like, this is the guy. So how did you come to that conclusion? What were some of your influences in finding that?
I literally have the chills all throughout my body. I mean, I feel like there's a secret underground tribe of people who know the word salutogenesis, and hopefully that little world is expanding. But just to kind of back up into it, my freshman year at USC, I basically took the approach of looking at the catalog of every class that USC offered. And instead of choosing a major, I chose, kind of a list of, about like 25 or so classes that I thought, like, I have to take these classes before I graduate. And one of the first ones that I took my freshman year was health, happiness, and well-being. That was taught by Professor Joel Milam in our health promotion department. And the name sounded so interesting, so fascinating to me. And that's sort of how Joel began the class. He talked about salutogenesis. And the way that I understood it, and my understanding is now, is that, you have your baseline health. So, I would say that probably the thing that our group at Stanford has really popularized is the understanding of measuring people longitudinally and measuring as much as you can, so we can get a very well characterized baseline on an individual. So, once you have that baseline, it's really interesting because you can see what fluctuates it up or down. So, for example, this is what we did for our early COVID-19 detection work through COVID. So we basically invented the first approach that showed you could use wearable biosensors and detect infectious diseases up to 10 days in some cases, before even the onset of first symptoms. So you go, how do you do something like that? And it's not based on absolute characterization, right? It's not like temperature, where you put a thermometer in somebody's mouth and, it's 98.6, so they're healthy, which, by the way, we know is actually an incorrect number. It's based on a whole different approach to characterizing disease, which is, how do you change over time? But once you get that concept of a baseline, then salutogenesis makes so much more sense as a concept. Because then what we see is most, if not all, of medicine and research is focused on everything below your baseline. It's focused on injury, illness, disease, things that drop you below, and then basically ask the question, how do we get you back to baseline? How do we get you back to normal? And salutogenesis and cytogenic medicine is really the concept of, what is everything above your baseline of health? What is health? What is happiness? What is resilience? What is longevity? What are these things that actually truly matter to us as individuals? And the larger concept there, which I would say is probably most important to me, especially when we start attacking a problem like depression, it's, can you actually solve a problem like depression without focusing on things above the baseline? Is part of the issue of why this hasn't been, kind of a disease that's been cracked really at all, considering that, basically, like 40 to 60% of people don't respond to their first antidepressant. Most people are depressed, have basically like 5 to 6 different depressive episodes in their lifetime, et cetera, et cetera. It's a major problem. Because we're only focusing on, your mood is going down, but we know nothing about happiness. We know nothing about resilience and higher levels of salutogenic functioning and flourishing in life. And so I'm extraordinarily passionate about that topic, James. I mean,
that's awesome. Dr. Amato, I just would say that, like, as you go through these, trainings with A4M, and now you bump into other psychiatrists, my thinking is the reason why they can't get it is because they don't get what Ben is just saying, like that, that psychotherapy and psychiatry is so rooted in pathogenesis that they just can't even get there, even though what Ben said about flourishing and so forth, it seems so obvious to people who haven't been fully educated in the process. Am I right in that?
Yes, and I think part of it comes back to just the nature of the healthcare system right now, where we have very abbreviated visits. We have a pretty narrow scope in terms of how we evaluate some of these things, and we have limited ability to make really in-depth root cause interventions. So yes, we focus on the pathogenesis, on finding out what are the symptoms so we can make a diagnosis, and then the algorithm is kind of what medication plugs into that particular diagnosis without asking those deeper questions that Ben is talking about.
Beautiful. Well, look, what I want to do now is actually dive into one particular area of sort of precision medicine, which is how stress and hormones affect depression. Because ultimately, what we're seeing and what we're advocating for is really a root cause salutogenic approach. And so we're super excited to have Dr. Carrie Jones to join us. And this is a pre-recorded interview I recorded last week. But as well as being a clinician, she's also the medical director of Precision Analytical, that is doing, the most hormone testing on mainly female patients, but also male patients across the community. And she had some very interesting ideas and concepts on how stress and hormones play into depression. So I'm going to share that now. Enjoy. So a warm welcome back to the show, Dr. Carrie Jones. Welcome, doctor.
My gosh, James, thank you so much. I always appreciate talking to you.
I'm really excited to dive into this reinvention of mental health topic with you. And particularly this episode is on depression. Mm-hmm. And from your stance as obviously being a clinician, but also, working with practitioners who use the Dutch test and working with Precision Analytical, mm-hmm. You're getting this N equals thousands or millions, of data coming in. And, obviously depression is such a critical topic. And I know mm-hmm. there's so many interesting pathways, how the two things connect. So I just wanted to maybe start with some anatomy, physiology and pathway conversation about how do you see depression manifest in, through the lens that you see?
Well, the lens that I primarily focus on, as you know, is hormones and cortisol. Of course, depression can be have other contributing factors, everything from mold to medications to obviously past history of trauma to nutritional. I mean, the triggers, the add-ons to depression are quite vast. But what I do day to day, or I work with men and women who, as part of their hormonal dysfunction or their through the roof stress or the complete burnout, depression is one of the symptoms that they report. And I see it with all our hormones. When we talk about depression, obviously we talk a lot about neurotransmitters. We talk about serotonin, right? We talk about dopamine, and we talk about even histamine. But our hormones have such a big play with those. Estrogen, testosterone, cortisol, DHEA, they go up to the brain and they can absolutely knock things out of balance, and it totally affects your mood. I mean, if you are a woman and you've never experienced PMS or any kind of mood swings either, or depression situationally or even long term, it's very uncommon to find, I see nowadays, and I bet you would agree.
Yeah, especially going through cycles of childbirth and child rearing mm-hmm. and all of that. Yeah, the episodic nature of it is very, very interesting. So when someone comes in with depression and you would think, okay, well, let's get some data here to see what's mm-hmm. going on. What are some common patterns that you see that are leading to depression that maybe your average physician is not aware of because they're not looking through this lens?
Absolutely. So with the hormones, we'll stick in that realm. Here's a great example, estrogen. So high estrogen or low estrogen, specifically estradiol, can affect depression. It can affect serotonin. It can affect dopamine. So when you go from tryptophan to 5-HTP, you have an enzyme, and to make that enzyme, you need estrogen. Estradiol has to bind to the estrogen receptor in the brain and say, hey, make the mRNA to help make this enzyme. And then you can go forward and make serotonin. So if you're low in estradiol, so think you're transitioning perimenopausal woman, think as you're menopausal woman, think as you're getting closer to your period and your estradiol is dropping. Think the woman who maybe has no periods, she has amenorrhea. Even men who are on high doses of aromatase inhibitors, so they're not making a lot of estrogen, it could, that doesn't affect everyone the same, impact their mood, as specifically leading to depression. Now, high estrogen is different. High estrogen can also affect how we make serotonin. So again, if you go back to that hormone, that amino acid tryptophan goes a couple of different ways. One, it can make protein, of course. One, it goes down to make serotonin, and then it can also split and go down to make what we call the kynurenine pathway with a K. And the reason we go down that pathway is to make NAD. NAD is super important as a co-nutrient for so many things in our body. Think like mitochondria. So 95% of our tryptophan goes that way. Only a small percentage goes to serotonin. And that imbalance can, or that percentage can get imbalanced when you have things like high estrogen excess, even cortisol excess. To be honest, the body will go, this is kind of a lot. I'm going to shift and make more NAD. So if you're in an estrogen excess state, man or woman, if you're in a cortisol excess state, man or woman, you may all notice also it's affecting your mood because you're just not making a lot of serotonin. Your percentage is dropping down. Maybe you were at 5% going that pathway, then you drop to 4%, maybe 3%. The percent doesn't seem like a lot, like 1%, no big deal. But if you're only at 5% that way, to drop to 3 is a big deal. So just thinking about the hormones in this way, when somebody presents to you and says, depression's been longstanding in my life. Oh, by the way, I have a lot of stress. Oh, by the way, I have a lot of hormonal issues. Just these key things can be quite helpful of, oh, you're 55 going through menopause. You've been noticing you're getting a lot more depressed. Turns out estrogen plays this role. Oh, you've went through an entire pandemic. You have massive amounts of stress. Your cortisol is really high. It's affecting your mood. Here's how it's affecting serotonin. So it's really nice to know the physiology so that you can turn around and then help them work on it.
That's super interesting. Just to go a bit deeper on one of those, I know we've done past podcasts and a lot of content about the cortisol awakening response and just like how that data can give you a look into so many things in someone's life and how it's all connected there. Can you talk to like some common patterns you see on that would help to understand a root cause of depression that might be missed in conventional care?
Going back to what I was saying with high cortisol. So if you wake up in the morning depressed, if that's a symptom that when somebody says, hey, do you wake up in the morning depressed? You go, yeah, actually, I do. But then it gets a little better as the day goes on, but my morning is the absolute worst. Oftentimes, not always, but often, that cortisol awakening response is over exaggerated. It's quite high. So think more like a very steep mountain as opposed to a high hill. And the reason is that high cortisol, that sort of like super burst that's higher than it should be, again, diverts tryptophan. The body goes, oh my gosh, there must be, a tiger. I'm going to switch. I'm going to start making NAD and not making as much serotonin because NAD is way more important to get you through than serotonin is. So that high morning cortisol. Now, on the flip side, you can have a different kind of depression where you can also wake up in the morning depressed, but it's kind of more of an all day long depression. And now you have low cortisol. So it's more of a burnout effect. And I think a lot of people over this last year can maybe more relate to that. Maybe they could relate to the morning depression in the beginning because they were waking up with that surge of cortisol because it was scary, the news, nobody knew it was happening. And now we're all pretty burned out. So our cortisol's low and we get that sort of flat affect feeling. We're not as motivated. We don't want to do the things. We require a lot of coffee, and we don't have that cortisol just to help give us some oomph and get us going.
Yeah, I'm sure that's that's a big deal. So obviously from the naturopathic playbook, what are your like favorite tools to, to start to unwind some of these things, and what are some of your go-tos when you're seeing a patient that is, experiencing depression?
Well, I'll say from a cortisol standpoint, one of my favorite things is to work with the circadian rhythm. And I say this all the time. You and I have talked about this, and it's free, cheap, and easy. And people like to roll their eyes and blow it off. But man, it works. The amount of anecdotal feedback I get from people are like, wow, I tried that and it worked. It's to use light and dark to your advantage, right? When you're working with cortisol, you want bright, full spectrum light exposure in the morning, and you want darkness at night. And when I say the morning, I mean pretty close to waking, within about 30 minutes of waking, which means I know that you're depressed and I know that you're not motivated, and you're in this sinking feeling. And it's to muster everything you can to get your booty out of bed and open up the window, go outside, go for a 5 or 10 minute walk your dog, because getting that full spectrum light, what it does, it helps reset your circadian rhythm. It gets cortisol normalized in the morning. And at night, you do the opposite. At night, you wind down. At night, you use darkness to your advantage. You want to sleep in complete darkness, because again, that just really helps that rhythm. But I am a big fan of, using adaptogens. I am a big fan of using amino acid support. I do use 5-HTP, especially in that low estrogen person who is struggling to get from tryptophan to the 5-HTP in the first place. I will get asked, do you use tryptophan? I'm like, I don't. I like it in foods, but I don't, because if they're struggling with estrogen or cortisol or inflammation in general, inflammation plays a massive role in depression, then they're going to favor the other pathway, NAD. So I'll use 5-HTP as a supplement to help them to make serotonin. But I'm also very cognizant of the fact that to create serotonin and to create dopamine uses the same enzyme. So I don't want to deplete your dopamine either. And dopamine helps with reward system, right? Pleasure, motivation. So I will also use things like tyrosine or mucuna, L-dopa as I'm helping with the neurotransmitter and the hormone effect.
Super interesting. Yeah, that's really, really cool. Well, I'm really grateful for you, sharing your wisdom with us on this special episode here on depression. I just know that given kind of where you sit on this sort of corner of all these different areas, I really wanted to ask you the question, sort of to take it a step back a bit. We're talking about the reinvention of mental health. I'd love to just get, your thoughts on that topic as broadly or as specifically as possible.
What the whole reinvention of mental health, man, I'm here for it. I am here for it, because I think as you know, and as I've been in the functional medicine field for 22 years, and to know that if you had any kind of mental health disorder, if you felt depressed, that it was like, here, take this pill, maybe see this therapist. And that was it. There was no digging into what could be the cause. What could be the cause of this brain on fire? Could it be your hormones? Could it be something you've been exposed to? Is it because of the medication that you're taking for other reasons? And so what I love with the reinvention that you're doing and that you're talking about is to get people to think, wait a minute, I have low estrogen, or I'm menopausal, or I'm on that medication, or my testosterone is low, or I do wake up requiring a lot of caffeine. I wonder if cortisol is an issue for me. Wait a minute, I would like to dig deeper, and I would like to empower myself and get answers and see what I can do about this depression that I am dealing with on a day-to-day basis. And so that's what I love about what you're doing, is just really trying to help empower people to, take their health back.
Beautiful. Well, look, thank you for your role in empowering so many practitioners with incredible, tools and education to be able to play their part. And yeah, we're always looking for ways to make this whole thing a lot more efficient, so way more people can have access to this type of care. And yeah, thank you for always bringing it here on the Evolution of Medicine.
Thanks, James. I appreciate it.
All right, so I always know Dr. Carrie Jones is going to bring it. So yeah, Ben, I'd love to just get your thoughts on that. You probably never seen that or heard of it, so I just love to get your thoughts first and see what stood out to you from that interview.
I thought that was really fantastic, and so there's sort of a premise that has guided a lot of our work in depression, and that is this concept called the social signal transduction theory or cascade of depression. And sort of the concept there is that, something happens in your environment, it's triggered, there's a trigger, and then your interior insula and dorsal anterior cortex get kind of activated, which then activates your HPA axis in the somatic nervous system. And then you basically start to go into this inflammatory gene expression state. And, now the body is in an inflammatory position. And the concept there is that from that research, which comes, kind of centrally from the Cousins Center of Psychoneuroimmunology at UCLA, basically, depression then becomes part of sickness behaviors. So if you look at what characterizes depression pragmatically, it's things like anhedonia, it's things like withdrawal and social isolation, et cetera, which also are, kind of like corollaries or symptoms of, say a flu, withdrawal, social isolation, sleeping, loss of pleasure, et cetera. So it's funny that she was basically talking about, kind of cortisol levels and sort of this inflammation response being tantamount to depressive symptoms, and burnout, because I think that is well in line with the literature that I see. And, moreover, the solution is really what we're all after, right? So, part of it is, kind of functional supplementation. So, how do you essentially help supplement these, tryptophan pathways and hormonal pathways. But then another part of it is actually behavioral. And, just to speak to this one more paragraph in, what we found was, if you look at that model of this psychosocial stress transduction cascade that links basically stress out there to inflammatory gene expression, the big question that, our team had was, well, what actually triggers that response? Is it something innate about the environment? So like, for example, you show somebody a snake or, CNN or Fox News, and there's something very innate about that experience, which automatically triggers these downstream, neurobiological effects? Or is it something that's intermediary to that? Like, for example, your perception or your belief system. So what we did was we investigated, and, this has now been done in over, I think, 300 people 4 separate times, 2 of which were led by our team. But we investigated, how do you quantify belief measurements? So we actually used this thing called the Primal World Index that, has been a very well characterized psychometric out of Martin Seligman's lab at UPenn. And, speaking of salutogenics, Martin Seligman is the father of positive psychology. So, very much in that space. So this measures beliefs, right? Like beliefs about the world being safe or enticing, or things, basically being full of life versus dead and mundane. And then we basically characterized how those beliefs relate to depression. And then simultaneously, how do certain biomarkers shift in response to those beliefs changing systematically over time. And what we found was that beliefs were perfectly anti-correlated with depression levels, satisfaction with life, gratitude, all of these things, and then also metabolomic and lipid profiles. And we also gathered microbiome data, which we haven't fully analyzed yet, but my expectation would be that we'd also see a similar type of shift between belief one, that the world is unsafe, and then a transformation to that the belief that the world is safe. So I think that one thing that can't be removed in this type of conversation is not just the biochemistry, like what's going on, on a biochemical pathway cellular level, but also the psychology that's also influencing the activation of these pathways or their inhibition. So, this is complex. Like you were saying earlier, James, it's like, I feel like everyone in this depression world has like a piece of the puzzle, but the puzzle, all the pieces haven't come together to be like, oh, this is the complete picture. Just do this, that, and that, and then you're done, you're fixed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, if it is coming together anywhere, it's in the offices of these doctors that have, more time to spend with patients, more access to more data, an education in an operating system that honors complexity, that celebrates complexity. So, Doctor, I'd love to just get your thoughts on first Carrie and then what Ben shared about that work too. I think I can see you nodding along.
Yeah. No, I think Carrie brought up some excellent points, and thinking about the role of hormones like cortisol and the sex hormones, particularly thinking of women and the various life stages women go through, where we know there are more windows of vulnerability for depression or other mental health disorders, whether it's puberty or the postpartum years or perimenopause. She also mentioned the importance of circadian rhythms. And I think that this is an area that is so often neglected, where we are a sleep deprived nation, looking at adults all the way down to kids. And it's gotten even worse in the past year with all of our reliance on screens and working from home. And so sometimes just an intervention, really looking at doing a little rehab with those circadian rhythms, can have a profound impact on mood and functioning. So I think she raised some very good points there. And to build upon what Ben is talking about, with that importance of not only looking at biological or genetic factors, but thinking of the psychosocial contributors to depression and other mental health conditions. And we know this from looking at the ACE study that was done years ago, and looking at the effects of early childhood trauma, and then extrapolating that out and looking at different health outcomes, not only in terms of mental health, but seeing that people who had a high degree of childhood trauma also had higher degrees of adult chronic illnesses, whether it was obesity or diabetes, asthma, in women seeing much higher rates of autoimmune disorders. So we know that things like trauma or chronic stress that start at an early age have a profound impact as people go through the life cycle.
Absolutely. I just love to, just come back to, I guess, now that you have the opportunity to sort of build the practice the way that you want to build it, right? What is your stack, and what order are you using? What interventions to try and, to help people overcome depression? I mean, and I would guess starting with the least costly, least invasive interventions first, and making your way up towards whatever else. Where do you start? What does everyone get? And then what do you bring in if you see certain pathways lighting up?
Sure. So mine is a primarily insurance-based practice. So most of the patients I'm seeing at this point are coming to me because they have depression, maybe PTSD, and anxiety usually runs along with those conditions, that has not responded, often to multiple antidepressant medications. Often they've been struggling with these conditions for many years, if not decades. And so everyone coming through the door gets a comprehensive intake, where I am really trying to look at all of those different biopsychosocial, spiritual aspects of what is going on with their depression. And I'm evaluating them for appropriateness for some of these treatments like ketamine and TMS. And people come through the door with different levels of readiness to consider potential functional medicine testing or interventions. But I at least try to expose people to this possibility that, okay, we may be using medications, or we may be using ketamine or TMS to help try to stabilize your symptoms. But beyond that, there are all these other things that we can look at when they're ready, that can help them feel better on a long-term basis. And my hope with having that discussion is to instill some hope in people who often have lost faith in treatments being helpful, and they've lost faith in the traditional medical system. So we focus first on trying to improve symptoms to where they then feel like they're able to invest some energy and some cognitive effort and things into making lifestyle changes that will hopefully shift their health in a different trajectory for a more long-term solution.
I love that. Beautiful. And yeah, makes perfect sense. And yeah, I guess one of the things I'm always just aware of is where in the life cycle are people catching patients, and you're catching them like after all these other interventions that have all either worked or not worked for a certain period of time. And that's a very different patient than someone who's like coming in and being like, oh, I think I'm a little depressed. Like, what should we do first? You know, it's very different, different kind of patient coming along. So Ben, I know Stanford is right in the middle of like Silicon Valley funding and tech, and there's this huge growth in spending and investment now in psychedelics and other things like digital therapeutics. What, from your perspective, when you look out at depression specifically, what's coming across your desk that you think that everyone needs to know about what this sort of reinvention of depression looks like, and what you think are some of the most promising things that you've got your eye on or that you have working in the lab there?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because I see all types of things, everything from, kind of psychedelics assisted psychotherapy to, as you said, digital therapeutics to, kind of novel, biotechnologies that are like psychedelics without psychoactive properties, so there's all, I think that this is definitely an area of interest, right? Like, I think obviously each one of us knows somebody who's been depressed or who is depressed, or, we've suffered ourselves, at the very least with a burnout or a high stressful experience. And it really matters. And I think that starting with that as a concept, then, especially in the Valley and in places like, kind of the Bay Area, people want to solve problems, and they want to solve problems that matter. I think that the challenge is just that, there's finding a solution that works, and then there's scaling something, into actual clinical practice, and then there's scaling something across clinical practices. And this, to me, is the entire crux of the issue. Like, between everyone that's, kind of listening to this right now, and everyone in your community, James, I'm sure that there are some people that have had tremendous results, kind of treating depression and doing something very weird, like, just shining red lights in people's eyes, and like, or giving them some type of cocktail of, amino acids and, kind of hormone replacement or whatever. And it's incredibly effective. It works. And then people come back resilient, et cetera. But then the next question becomes, well, how do you translate that into something that scales, that payers will pay for, that patients will trust and understand, and that other physicians will adopt? And the reason why I'm saying it so broadly like that is because we know that diet and exercise works. You know what I mean? Like, we don't need more advanced technology than diet and exercise. If we could just prescribe that to people, and there was high levels of compliance and adherence, we would see probably rates of depression and stress and, morbidity.
I want to just ask you more about that, because like, I'm really glad you said that. I guess to both of you, and starting with you, Ben, do you see a reinvention of depression that isn't built around salutogenesis? Like, is there anything coming that strongly where it was like, well, we don't even need to worry about exercise and nutrition, because ultimately this gizmo is going to solve everything anyway? Or do you feel like it has to go through this pathway?
The happiness pill. I think that's the false promise. Do you know what I mean? Like, I would bet on a company that has amazing results. Like, for example, I would bet on psychedelics and the psychedelic revolution, that it's totally transforming people's lives and making them better. But I wouldn't bet on that for the next 50 years. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's going to be a wave, kind of like Prozac was a wave. When it came out, people were so excited. Physicians were prescribing it left and right, and it was a miracle drug. But the thing is that, kind of what we've seen in the arc of a lot of these interventions that come out is that they sort of become like fads. They work for a period of time. And then what we realize is that, oh, it's sort of a bump that can potentially get somebody out of a really toxic, nauseous state. But then if they don't shift their mindset, if they don't shift their lifestyle, like it's only going to last so long. They're happier now, so they're staying up later at night and they're taking on more work. And then that's going to end up being, coming full circle, having them crash. And I'm curious what, Dr. Amato sees here, but, I would say that if it doesn't come back to the core, then you'll never solve the problem.
Yeah, and Ben, I really agree with you. And when I have discussions with people about what to expect from these treatments like ketamine or TMS, or even as I'm starting to talk to people about psychedelics being on the frontier, I talk to them about how my hope with these treatments is that it opens a window for them. It opens a window of opportunity, and that these treatments provide a springboard to then have the energy, motivation, cognitive power to dive in and do the other things that are going to bring them lasting health. So after feeling some improvement, that's where I want to have discussions with people about dietary changes, or working on mindset, or incorporating a daily meditation practice, or really giving more thought to meaning and purpose in life and community. That is a really huge part. And I think that's one of the big things we learned from the experiences of this past year with COVID is, people's mental health is deteriorating with this combination of stress, but also the isolation that has taken place in the last year. So yes, these treatments, whether it's medications or ketamine, TMS, whatever it may be, they may provide some relief and a window of opportunity, but there's so much more that needs to be done to see a longer term, healthier outlook.
Yeah. And by the way, just because I want to answer your question, James, I mean, the technology that's coming is really cool. Like that is for sure, in terms of like the neurofeedback, consciousness hacking type technology, where, I spoke to one entrepreneur who literally is creating like an avatar and basically training it with AI to speak to you as your friend and just like follow you across all of your devices and speak nicely to you. And I forgot what the name of this like AI avatar on Instagram is, but it was invested in by Andreessen Horowitz. But they're very lifelike, they're very real. And the concept that you could be calling and talking to, kind of an AI like in her, and it's there to kind of build you up and make you excited. I mean, this type of technology is really coming. Like, I've also seen light-based technologies that are basically kind of transforming people's autonomic systems, and so all of that stuff I think is in the periphery, not to mention brand new type of biotech, right? So the more that we dive deep into the cellular basis of depression and happiness too, because by the way, we might not actually find what we're looking for from a biotech perspective, looking at depressed people. We might only find it looking at happy people, in the same way that when you look at, C. difficile treatments with fecal matter transplants, you're not doing a transplant from a, unhealthy person into a healthy person. You're looking at the healthy person's microbiome to then go intervene on an unhealthy person. So I think same for happiness. Like, when we start to think about metabolomic technologies, where with, kind of untargeted metabolomics, we literally at this point can measure 20,000 molecules from a drop of blood. And when you start to think about how many molecules you're actually testing for at a Quest lab and a LabCorp, you're talking about hundreds. So what is this biological dark matter in like, the 1,000 to 20,000 range of untargeted metabolites that are floating around in your blood? We don't know. Most of them are uncharacterized in that sense. But how do we see those changing with somebody who goes from depressed to happy, or somebody who is just happy? And maybe there is a molecule there that you can package up, as an exosome in some lipid bilayer and, kind of inject it straight into somebody. And then all of a sudden, they're in super happy land in a promise that Prozac had. I mean, this is coming. Like there is for sure going to be patents out there in the next like 5, years or even sooner. And there are some projects that I'm working on where that's one of the goals of them, is to go find those, biomarkers and then create novel therapeutics. But then again, to what, Dr. Amato is saying, it all just comes back to it. So granted, you put that happy pill in somebody, but they're just sitting around happy all the time, and they're not exercising and they're not eating right. I'm not sure that it's sustainable.
Yeah, no, exactly. Well, look, I really appreciate both of your thoughts on all of this. And I guess I just wanted to wrap up here tonight by I guess, sharing like my thesis on this and sort of why the evolution of medicine has taken the journey it has and how we're getting to here. So one thing you said, Ben, that I thought was really important is like, it's one thing to have a solution, but then how does that solution get passed down through practices and out to everyone? And if you look at functional medicine, when we started the evolution of medicine in 2014, functional medicine was being practiced by a few doctors in the major cities. And if you were really sick or if you were, really rich, you could fly there and you could interact with them and you could use that. And ultimately, our first goal was twofold. One was to make it easier for doctors to learn about functional medicine, to make shows like this were free, that anyone in the world could watch and they could get into it, but also then to bring practitioners together and bring doctors together. And that was really the basis for these functional forum meetup groups. And I'm excited to share that what's happening in the background is we are rebuilding our functional forum communities. And at our next functional forum, I'll be able to share about our first 28 cities that are going to be launching in September to put doctors who are practicing functional medicine into rooms with other doctors and have a cross-pollination, because in order to accelerate the evolution of medicine, that has to happen. But also, we needed to make it easier for doctors to actually practice functional medicine. So I'm super grateful, to our not really sponsors, but the resources that we have in our organization, where we've curated sort of best in category resources through things like education, Institute for Functional Medicine, supplement prescribing with FullScript, lab ordering with Genova Diagnostics, patient education with Lifestyle Matrix, even electronic medical records for functional medicine with Serbo, and some of the coaching organizations. But I wanted to share here, because this is the reinvention of mental health, that I wanted to just put a spotlight on Heal Community, because it's a project that I've been working here for a while. And actually, Dr. Amato here is a client of Heal Community, and we're rolling out virtual groups to her patient population starting here in September. So just to share like a couple of updates since, we last spoke, but we have data now on what happens when you put people into virtual salutogenic groups. And it's unbelievably healthy. So just to take you through, we saw if people had a high level of depression, so if their depression was higher than average, 74.7% of people experienced an improvement during the initial 12 weeks, which was our pilot groups. And it was actually the same number for fatigue. It was about 60% for anxiety. We saw 72% in sleep disturbances, and the correlation there between sleep we just heard today, and that makes a big impact. And social struggles, actually, wanting to participate in the world. All of these things were affected. And really, what I've come to see over time in functional medicine is that if we measure people's health along the bottom, and we say, okay, really ill people on one end and really healthy on the other, very, very empowered, healthy people and very, very sick people have kind of found their way to other types of medicine, or are finding their way. But ultimately, it's this big part, the middle of the bell curve, people who are either on their way towards, long-term health and happiness because, they're able to create self-efficacy, or they're on a pathway to long health, long chronic illness. And ultimately, we need to have structures that can facilitate most people to go back to full flourishing health that is only possible with salutogenic care. And so through Heal Community, essentially, we are partnering with clinics like Dr. Amato, where the clinic identifies qualified patients, prescribes the program, and submits the billing. And then Heal Community does everything else, where we will actually facilitate all aspects of the group, train the coaches, track the outcomes, develop the content, and hire the coaches. And ultimately, our goal is that this can spread like wildfire, and that salutogenic groups, built around changing mindset, built around doing healthy behaviors, can really just become the standard of care. So if you are taking insurance and you're in America, we'd love to hear from you at Heal Community. Our goal is really to get this to, the sickest and poorest in society of not being able to access this operating system of care. Dr. Amato, I just want to, first of all, just acknowledge, what it means to choose to do this medicine on insurance, because there's so much about the payer system that has traditionally thwarted efforts of people to really get to the root cause of people. So I want to commend you. And I also want to, I'm grateful for you, believing in this concept and starting to roll this out. How do you see virtual groups fitting in with your new practice, and why are you interested in it?
Well, I think this is a really exciting development. To be able to build these programs to insurance and to really take the programs into people's homes with the technology. And it really helps to not only deliver the education that people need, but the level of support they're able to get from the health coaching, but also from the community at large. It really helps to address that whole concern about isolation and how important it is to feel like you have community behind you when you're trying to make profound changes.
Ben, we got to talk about this for the first time just the other day, and I just love for you to weigh in, because I feel like finally, after a few hours and breakfast, I got it. I was able to communicate what I was thinking when I created this company, and I'd love to get your thoughts.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that this is definitely the wave of the future, and I'm extremely excited by what you're doing. I mean, if I were a physician listening to this for the first time, I would for sure integrate it into my practice, because it's just such a benefit for individuals. It goes back to full totality of care, and, bringing forth these lifestyle factors of diet and exercise. I mean, think about, well, what's the best technology to, actually enable that? It's probably peer support. And peer pressure, ironically, will lead you towards the good side or the bad side.
Yeah.
And also the idea of how do you scale this information? That's one of the challenges as a psychiatrist. There's only so much work I can do by seeing one patient at a time, but the idea of being able to scale this and offer it to a group, and to work to partner also with a health coach who can deliver a lot of this information, it just empowers me to take this information to so many more people.
Beautiful. Well, look, I'm super grateful for both of you in both of your worlds taking this whole thing forward, and I'm super excited to see what will come back from this episode, because I think we've had some strong functional medicine fundamentals, but I think one of the things that this show has always been about, right, has been kind of inspiring the functional medicine community to say, look, see, it's happening. Real people are starting to understand that we were right and we do need this. And the fact that there's just been so much friction in the system, right, to stop doctors, bringing it on, and patients, adapting it and adopting it, and then whole system transformation. In one of the first episodes of the Functional Forum, Mark Hyman came on and announced the Cleveland Clinic Center for Functional Medicine. And it was just kind of a moment where I realized, people in our community want to be inspired, because there's a lot of depressing information about how medicine is still the same as it was, and people aren't getting better, and the life expectancy is going down for the first time in our lifetimes. And so, to see that not only is clinical practice shifting, but also at the center of the future of the medical world in the Stanford Innovation Lab, they understand salutogenesis. They're looking for solutions that, facilitate salutogenesis. It's a super, super exciting time to be alive. And I'm super grateful for both of you sitting in the seats that you're sitting in and doing it. So this is part 2 of a 3-part series. Next month, which is September 13th, we're going to be looking at addiction specifically, and we have some addiction specialists, and we're going to be talking about the reinvention of mental health around addiction. I wouldn't be surprised if some of the things that we've talked about come up again, but we've got Dr. Paul Thomas, who wrote an amazing book on addiction. We've got a doctor called Amy De La Garza from Salt Lake City, who runs a really innovative addiction center. And then a super exciting announcement for all of you is that it has been almost 3 years since we did a live forum where the show was live, and we had meetups all around the country and all around the world watching together at the same time, texting me or tweeting me in the breaks and having me ask questions to the panel. But we're doing it live. We're doing it again. Boulder, Colorado, November 1st. So if you're in the Boulder area, we'll have information about the tickets really soon. E-Town is such an amazing venue. The way they set it up, an incredible talent pool there in Boulder. So I just wanted to give everyone a heads up, and I'm super excited to share that the meetup groups are reforming, and by November we'll have at least 28 cities coming together, but more and more brands are coming in wanting to be partnered on the communities, and we're super excited to see the functional medicine revolution gaining steam. So thank you, Ben. Thank you, Dr. Amato. This has been the Functional